Hey everyone, welcome to another deep dive. This time we're digging into this whole Canada Post strike thing.
Yeah, it's been going on for a while now, right?
It has, like, over 55,000 workers walking off the job,
Yeah, and right before the holidays too adds another layer to it all, doesn't it?
for sure. And I know a lot of you out there are probably wondering what it all means, especially for smaller businesses.
Right, those smaller businesses that rely so much on affordable shipping.
Exactly. So to get to the bottom of this, we've been combing through news articles, a research paper on postal service models, even spent some time on Reddit.
Always good source for passionate opinions.
Always. And we found a lot to talk about. It's day 25 of the strike, no resolution yet, and it feels like everyone's kind of waiting with bated breath.
Definitely a lot of uncertainty in the air. So
Yeah.
maybe a good place to start is to give everyone a quick rundown of how we got here.
Sounds good. So, for those who haven't been following every twist and turn, the strike officially began on November 14th, 2024.
And right from the get-go, those mediation efforts just seem to hit a wall.
They did it. Canada Post did put forward a new proposal on December 6th, but
But the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, they're still reviewing it.
which is making some people pretty anxious, especially with Christmas right around the corner.
And Hanukkah Kwanzaa.
Yeah, all the holidays.
All the holidays. And it's interesting to compare this to those other big strikes we saw earlier this year. You know, the port workers back in August and the rail workers in November.
Oh, yeah. In both those cases, the government stepped in almost immediately with that back-to-work legislation.
But with Canada Post, it's been crickets for 25 days.
And people are noticing the difference big time.
They are. There's a comment I saw on Reddit that really sums it up. Railroad workers, .feds get involved, 1 day. Port workers, .feds get involved, 3 days. Post office at crickets, 25 days and counting.
Yeah, and it kind of makes you wonder, right? Is the government sending a message about which sectors they consider truly essential?
It's a good question.
Hmm.
It definitely highlights this whole debate about how we define essential in today's world.
Because, yeah, on one hand, you've got those ports and railways, absolutely critical for moving goods on a massive scale. But then on the other hand, you've got Canada Post.
Which plays such a vital role for individuals and those smaller businesses,
Yeah.
especially those in rural communities that don't have a lot of other options.
Yeah, exactly. And speaking of small businesses, there was this one Reddit user, Buffalo Jeremy. His comment really stuck with me.
What do you say?
He said, and I'm quoting here, "My business has $600,000 in accounts receivable. Most of that is paid by check in the mail. I guess I just get to wait and hope I can make payroll till this is fixed."
Wow, that's a lot of money just hanging in the balance.
It is. And it makes you realize just how vulnerable so many of these smaller businesses are. They're often operating on such tight margins. They really need those affordable and dependable services like Canada Post.
This strike could be devastating for them,
It could. And some people are even saying it's another example of how government policies.
which might be well-intentioned,
Yeah.
can end up unintentionally favoring those larger corporations.
Yeah. The ones that can weather these kinds of storms more easily.
Exactly. They've got that buffer.
So it's definitely not a level playing field. And then you add in Canada Post's own financial troubles.
Oh, right. They're not exactly rolling in dough, are they?
Nope. Reports say they're projected to have a $743 million deficit for 2023.
Oof.
And it's looking even worse for this year,
How much worse?
pushing close to $1 billion in the red.
$1 billion. I mean, no wonder everyone's so on edge with this strike. But what's causing these losses? Is it just the strike, or is there something more fundamental going on?
Well, a big part of it is the shift in the market.
Yeah.
Canada Post is stuck with this massive infrastructure built for delivering letters to every corner of the country.
Right, to every single mailbox.
Yeah.
But these days, how many people are actually sending letters?
Exactly. Meanwhile, companies like Amazon, who they're competing with more and more, are laser focused on those urban areas. They're using gig workers and algorithms to optimize those delivery routes, keeps their costs way down.
It's a model that's really hard for Canada Post to match. It's like they're trying to turn a giant ship.
While Amazon's zipping around in speedboats.
Exactly. So they're in a tough spot, trying to maintain that universal service while also competing in this rapidly changing market.
So it's kind of like that classic tale of disruption, right?
Like old guard versus the agile newcomers.
Right. But isn't framing it as David versus Goliath a bit simplistic? I mean, Canada Post isn't exactly a tiny startup.
True.
Yeah.
It's definitely more nuanced than that. I mean, they do have that massive infrastructure, but they're also reliant on revenue, not taxpayer dollars to operate.
So they're walking a tightrope between providing a public service and trying to stay afloat in this crazy competitive market.
Makes sense. So where do the workers fit into all of this? What are they actually asking for in this whole negotiation?
So the Canadian Union of Postal Workers, they're seeking a 19% wage increase over 4 years. Now, that might sound like a lot to some people.
Yeah, 19%. It's a pretty significant jump.
It is. But it's important to remember that these workers haven't seen a raise since 2018.
Since 2018.
Wow.
And what about before that?
Before that, it was actually a decade of wage freezes.
So they're trying to make up for lost time.
Exactly. The union's argument is that this increase is absolutely necessary to ensure a living wage for their members, especially with the cost of living skyrocketing these past few years.
Makes sense.
Huh.
But what's the public's take on this? Are they sympathetic to the workers, or are they seeing it as unreasonable?
The discussions online are all over the place. Some people are calling the workers greedy, saying they're asking for too much.
But others are totally on their side.
Right. They're saying these workers deserve a living wage, especially after years of no raises, and that the public should be supporting them, not criticizing them.
So it's pretty divided. Is there anything else that's causing a lot of tension in the negotiations?
Yeah, weekend work is another big point of contention.
Ah, yes. That age-old struggle. What's the sticking point there?
Well, management wants to hire part-timers for those weekend shifts.
They're probably thinking it'd be more cost-effective.
Right. And they argue it would help them keep up with the growing demand. But the union, they want to keep double-time pay for their full-time workers on weekends.
So they see it as protecting their members and fairly compensating them for having to work those less desirable shifts.
Exactly. Plus, those weekend shifts have traditionally been a way for full-time postal workers to earn some extra money.
A nice little bonus.
Yeah.
So it's a benefit they're not willing to give up easily.
Not without a fight, that's for sure. And then there's the government. They've been awfully quiet on this whole thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, in those other strikes, they jumped right in.
Yeah.
But with this one,
Silence. Which makes you wonder what their game plan is.
what are they waiting for?
Right. Are they just hoping it'll resolve itself?
Ugh.
Or are they waiting for the right moment to step in?
Only time will tell, I guess.
It will, but the longer this drags on,
And the more those economic impacts start piling up,
the harder it's going to be for them to stay on the sidelines.
definitely. So the question is, what kind of intervention are we talking about?
Right. Legislating the workers back to work? A bailout?
Or maybe something completely different. We'll have to wait and see.
Exactly. But that's a conversation for another time.
Part 2. Cliffhanger.
You got it. But in the meantime, I think it's important to remember that there are real people at the heart of this, workers, who are fighting for what they believe in.
Businesses that are struggling to stay afloat.
And everyday Canadians who are just trying to get by.
And it's impacting all of us in different ways. So while we wait to see how this all unfolds, I think it's important to be patient.
And to try to understand the different perspectives at play.
Because ultimately, finding a solution that works for everyone is going to require a lot of empathy.
And a willingness to compromise.
Definitely. And maybe even a little bit of creativity.
Creativity never hurts. So let's keep those conversations going. Let's listen to each other.
And let's hope for a resolution that's fair and just for everyone involved.
Well said. Now, before we move on to part 2, I wanted to touch on one more thing. This whole Canada Post situation, it's got me thinking about the bigger picture. You know, the future of work in general. Because it's not just mail carriers whose jobs are potentially at risk.
No, it's happening across so many different industries.
Automation, artificial intelligence.
They're changing the game, and we need to be prepared.
We do. So stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to dive into some of those long-term solutions that are being discussed.
We'll explore some pretty radical ideas.
We will, and we'll try to figure out what a sustainable future for essential services like Canada Post could actually look like.
Should be interesting.
I think so. So buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
Can't wait. They've been awfully quiet, haven't they?
Yeah.
But as this thing drags on, and those economic impacts start to really bite.
It's got to be getting harder for them to just sit on the sidelines, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Especially if we start to see real damage. Not just inconvenience. Like, what if businesses start going under?
Then the pressure to act is really going to ramp up.
Definitely. So what do you think? What kind of intervention are we talking about here?
Well, I mean, the nuclear option is that back-to-work legislation, right?
Force everyone back to their jobs. But historically, hasn't that been pretty ineffective?
Yeah, it just kind of kicks the can down the road. Doesn't actually solve anything.
And it probably just breeds more resentment on both sides.
Exactly. So politically, that's a tough one.
Really tough.
Oh.
Especially with public opinion already so divided on this whole thing.
If they want to avoid accusations of siding with big business or the unions.
A bailout might be the more palatable option.
Interesting. So basically just throwing money at the problem. But wouldn't that go against the government's whole,
Fiscal responsibility thing.
Yeah, exactly.
True, but if they frame it as an investment, a vital injection of funds to maintain an essential service.
Especially for those rural and remote communities.
Right. The ones that would be hit the hardest.
Hmm. Yeah, I guess that's a slightly easier sell, politically speaking.
Maybe. But let's be real.
Hmm.
Neither option is going to be popular.
And we're not even talking about long-term solutions here. This is just putting a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem.
Exactly. Because whichever way this immediate crisis goes, the big question still looms. What does a sustainable future for Canada Post even look like?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. This institution that's been around for what feels like forever suddenly seems so fragile.
It is. It really highlights how much the world has changed.
Mm.
And it's not just a Canada Post thing either. This is happening to postal services all over the globe.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Declining mail volumes thanks to the digital age, the rising costs of, well, everything,
Mm.
and that constant pressure to modernize
Yeah.
or else become completely irrelevant.
So are we headed for a world without the Postal Service as we know it? Like no more mail carriers, no more sorting plants, just drones and robots zipping around?
It's not impossible. Some experts are saying that Canada Post needs to radically streamline its operations.
Yeah.
Maybe even cut certain services just to stay afloat.
There was that one comment on Reddit that suggested something pretty drastic.
Well, yeah, what is...
This user, not this. They proposed cutting staff in half, giving everyone a $10 raise, and only delivering mail twice a week.
Whoa. That's a pretty bold idea.
It is, but it does highlight the need for some out-of-the-box thinking here.
So maybe a leaner, more focused Canada Post is the answer. Focus on those core services, like package delivery and serving those remote communities.
The ones where there are no other options.
Right. But wouldn't that mean a much smaller workforce?
Yeah. And then there are the social implications to consider. The impact on those workers' jobs and livelihoods.
Not to mention the potential pushback from communities that rely on those services. It's a tough situation. Complex, with no easy answers.
But if we zoom out a little, isn't this kind of a microcosm of what's happening in a lot of industries right now? Technology disrupting traditional ways of doing things, growing anxieties about job security.
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
Yeah.
Automation is already reshaping the job market, and it's not unreasonable to think that it could play a much bigger role in mail and package delivery in the years to come.
So what does that mean for postal workers? Are their jobs actually at risk?
It's a valid concern for sure.
Hmm.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that it's not about fearing technology, but about acknowledging its potential impact and planning for a future where certain jobs might become obsolete.
So we need to start thinking about solutions now.
We do. Things like retraining programs, robust social safety nets to help those workers transition.
It feels like we're in this weird in-between phase right now where the old ways aren't working anymore, but we haven't quite figured out the new reality yet.
A time of transition, for sure. It requires a willingness to adapt, to innovate, to maybe even reinvent ourselves.
And that goes for institutions like Canada Post as much as it does for individuals.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're all in this together.
So back to Canada Post, can they actually pull off this like phoenix rising from the ashes kind of transformation, or is this the beginning of the end?
I think it's a crossroads. They can cling to the old ways and risk becoming increasingly irrelevant,
Yeah.
or they can embrace innovation, find ways to adapt to these new demands, and maybe even find a whole new relevance.
But reinventing yourself when you're a massive organization like Canada Post, that can't be easy.
It's a tall order for sure. It's going to require some strong leadership, a clear vision for the future, and a willingness to make some tough decisions.
And what about the workers?
Right. They need to be part of the conversation too. Their knowledge, their experience, their concerns, all of that needs to be factored in.
It's about finding that balance, isn't it? Between tradition and innovation, between serving all Canadians and staying financially viable.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating and honestly so important. The choices we make today, both as individuals and as a society, they're going to determine what the future of essential services like Canada Post looks like.
And those choices are going to have a ripple effect on the economy, on jobs, on how we connect with each other.
It's a lot to think about,
Yeah.
which is why I'm so glad we're having this conversation.
Well, me too. But I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about the timeline of the strike, the factors that are driving it, the impacts on everyone from small businesses to everyday Canadians.
We even touched on those bigger questions about the future of work, the role of technology, the government's role in all of this.
And I think one thing's for sure, This story is far from over. We've got a lot more to unpack.
Yeah.
And I know you're particularly interested in the potential long-term solutions that are being discussed. It really does feel like we're at a turning point,
Yeah.
not just for Canada Post, but for how we think about essential services in general.
Yeah, and this strike, it's forcing us to re-examine some of those assumptions we've held for so long. Like, what does universal service actually mean in the digital age?
Right, like does everyone really need mail delivered to their door every single day? Or could we shift to a system where it's less frequent but still reliable?
I mean, think about it. Most of what we get in the mail these days, it's just junk.
Bills, flyers.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe it's time to rethink that whole model.
Yeah.
And actually, that research paper we looked at, it outlined a few different models that other countries are experimenting
Oh,
with.
yeah. Like some are moving towards a system where they partner with private companies for things like last mile delivery.
So basically using the existing postal infrastructure, but making it more cost effective.
Right. It's like a hybrid approach.
Yeah.
And it could be a way for Canada Post to leverage its strengths,
Hmm.
that vast network they already got, while also adapting to a market that's increasingly dominated by e-commerce.
Hmm. It's an interesting idea, but I'm sure there are some potential downsides too. Right?
Oh, for sure. Some critics are worried that relying too heavily on those private companies could lead to higher prices for consumers, especially in those rural areas where it's already more expensive to deliver.
And what about the workers?
Yeah, there are definitely concerns about job security. If you start outsourcing those core functions, what happens to the existing workforce?
Those are all important questions that need to be carefully considered.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding a solution that works on paper, It's about making sure that any changes are implemented in a way that's fair and equitable for everyone involved.
Right. It's got to be a win-win, not just for the corporations, but for the workers and the communities they serve.
Exactly. And that's where the government's role becomes so crucial. They need to provide clear guidance, set standards, and ensure that any transition is managed in a way that doesn't leave anyone behind.
Easier said than done, though. Right?
Oh, it's a huge challenge. It's going to require some tough conversations. But I think this whole situation has highlighted how important it is to have those conversations, even if they're uncomfortable.
We can't just stick our heads in the sand and pretend everything's fine.
Nope. We got to be proactive, think critically, and be willing to challenge those old ways of doing things.
Because this isn't just about Canada Post. It's about the future of work itself.
How do we prepare for a world where automation and AI are going to fundamentally change the job market?
It's a big question
Hmm.
and a scary one for a lot of people. But I don't think it's about fearing progress.
It's about shaping that progress in a way that benefits everyone.
Exactly. We need to be investing in education, in retraining programs, in creating opportunities for people to adapt and thrive in this new landscape.
And maybe part of that is shifting our mindset too. Maybe we need to start thinking about work less as a fixed job.
And more as a set of skills that we can constantly develop and adapt.
Right. It's about lifelong learning, being adaptable, being open to new possibilities.
And I think that's a message that resonates far beyond this particular situation. This is something we can all take to heart.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Canada Post strike, what stood out to you the most? What are you going to be thinking about as you wait for those packages to start moving again?
For me, it's the interconnectedness of it all.
Hmm.
You know how this one labor dispute has touched on so many different aspects of our society: economics, technology, social equity, the future of work. It's a reminder that we're all in this together, and that the choices we make today, they have a ripple effect for years to come.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's been a fascinating journey, and I hope you found it insightful too.
Me too. I've learned a lot.
And hey, maybe this whole experience will even inspire you to send a good old-fashioned letter to someone you care about.
Once the mail starts flowing again.
Exactly. Support your local postal worker.
I like it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and maybe even go hug your mail carrier. They probably need it right now.
They probably do.
All right, we'll see you next time.